The moment my new director walked past me in the hallway without making eye contact, I knew. Not suspected, knew. I'd been in municipal infrastructure long enough to read the room. 31 years managing water treatment systems across 3 provinces, the last 18 of them as senior operations engineer for the Regional Water Authority outside Calgary. I'd outlasted 4 directors, 2 restructurings, and 1 actual flood. I thought I'd outlast this too. I was wrong about that part. His name was Bryson. Early 40s, sharp suit, came from a private consulting firm in Toronto that specialized in what he called operational modernization. He'd been brought in after the authority's board got nervous about budget overruns and started listening to people who used the phrase legacy inefficiency like it was a diagnosis. Bryson walked in with a 40-slide deck, a lot of confidence, and almost no knowledge of how water treatment actually worked at the field level. The first meeting he ran, he spent 20 minutes explaining to my team what a SCADA system was. My team had been running SCADA for 11 years. I watched my colleague Thomas, who'd been with me since the Lethbridge expansion, write something in his notebook and turn it slightly so I could read it. It said, "Here we go." I didn't say anything in that meeting. I'd learned a long time ago that the right response to being underestimated is patience, not protest. What I hadn't planned for was how quickly things would move. Within 3 weeks of Bryson's arrival, I got called into a meeting with him and the Deputy Director of Operations, a woman named Sylvia, who I respected and who, I could tell, was uncomfortable with what was happening. Bryson did most of the talking. He said the authority was moving toward a streamlined technical leadership model. He said the organization needed people who could pivot quickly in a changing regulatory environment. He said, and I remember this exactly because I've replayed it many times, that the role required digital native thinking. I was 57 years old. I'd been maintaining Alberta's water infrastructure since before Bryson had finished his undergrad, and sitting there in that meeting room with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, I understood that digital native thinking was a phrase designed to make age discrimination sound like a skills gap. Sylvia couldn't look at me directly. That told me everything. They offered me a package. Technically a voluntary separation. The numbers were decent. 22 weeks of severance, benefit continuation for 8 months, a reference letter that Bryson would sign. I had 2 weeks to decide. I drove home on Deerfoot Trail in silence. My wife, Carolyn, was waiting in the kitchen when I got in, and she took one look at my face and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her mug, and she listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. That was honest. What I didn't tell her, not that night, was that I had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen to the system after I left. Not because I'd planned anything. Because I understood something that Bryson didn't. The water treatment network I'd spent 18 years building was not a product. It was a relationship between technology, regulation, and human judgment. You couldn't modernize it with a consulting deck. You could only break it faster. And there was one specific thing I hadn't mentioned to anyone in that meeting room. Let me back up. In 2014, the authority had applied for federal funding through Infrastructure Canada's Clean Water and Wastewater Fund. It was a significant application, close to $40 million for a treatment plant upgrade in the Foothills District. I was the technical lead on the application. I'd spent 4 months writing the compliance documentation, the operational protocols, and the specialized chemical dosing algorithms that the upgraded plant would use. Here's the part that matters. Those algorithms were developed by me on my own time, using my own research going back to my graduate work at the University of Alberta. I'd licensed them to the authority under a specific agreement, not a blanket employment IP transfer, but a limited use license tied to my continued oversight role. My lawyer had been very clear about this at the time. The authority's legal team had reviewed it, agreed to the terms, and everyone had moved on because no one ever imagined there would be a scenario where I wasn't there. The license had a clause. If I was separated from the authority involuntarily and not retained in at least a consulting capacity, the license reverted to me after 90 days. The authority would retain access to the existing plant data, but they would lose the right to run the dosing algorithm. which had become, over 10 years, the backbone of how 3 of our treatment plants maintained their Health Canada compliance thresholds. I hadn't thought about this clause in years. Honestly, it wasn't a trap I'd set. It was a protection I built for myself when I was still young enough to be uncertain about my future there. And then it had just sat in a filing cabinet while I got comfortable. I remembered it the night after that meeting with Bryson. I went downstairs after Carolyn was asleep, and I found the original agreement in my files. I read it twice. Then I called my lawyer in the morning. He confirmed what I already knew. The clause was valid, it was clear, and it was ticking. I signed the separation package. I shook Bryson's hand. He was warm, almost enthusiastic in the way that people are when they think they've won something. I said I hoped the transition would go smoothly. I meant that genuinely, actually. Not for his sake, but because the last thing I wanted was for any disruption to affect the communities those plants served. But I also knew what I knew. The 90 days began the day my separation was finalized, March 12th. I spent those first weeks doing things I'd neglected for years. I refinished the deck. I drove out to visit my older brother in Red Deer, who I hadn't seen properly since Christmas. Carolyn and I went to Banff for a long weekend and hiked the Johnston Canyon Trail in the snow, which we hadn't done since our kids were small. I started cooking dinner most nights, which my daughter found suspicious when she called. "You're weirdly calm," she said. "Should I be worried?" I told her I was fine. I was fine. But I was also watching. Not obsessively, not with any pleasure in what I expected to come. More the way you watch a weather system move in from the mountains when you've lived here long enough to know what it means. I heard things through the community. The water treatment world in Alberta is not large. Former colleagues would mention things casually, that Bryson's team had brought in a software contractor from Vancouver to re-platform the operational systems, that there was some confusion about the dosing parameters at the Foothills plant, that Health Canada had sent a letter requesting clarification on recent compliance reporting. That last one got my attention. In Alberta's water sector, a letter from Health Canada requesting compliance clarification is not nothing. The drinking water standards under the Safe Drinking Water Act are not suggestions. The authority held federal funding obligations that came with ongoing regulatory requirements. If those requirements were not being met, or if the data trail supporting them was suddenly unclear, the consequences moved quickly and they moved publicly. I didn't celebrate when I heard this. I want to be honest about that. There's a version of this story where I'm gleefully watching from the sidelines, and that's not what this was. These were systems that served real people. The thought of anything going wrong at the level that actually mattered, treatment quality, public health, was not something I wished for. What I did feel was a kind of sorrow, honestly. The quiet grief of watching something you built get treated carelessly by someone who didn't understand its weight. The call came on day 88. I was in the garage, which I'd been reorganizing all week, when my phone rang. It was Sylvia. Not Bryson, Sylvia. Her voice was measured, but I could hear what was underneath it. She said the authority was in a difficult position. She said the contractor who had been brought in to update the operational systems had flagged that the dosing algorithm wasn't functioning correctly under the new platform environment, and that attempts to replicate its outputs using the documentation they had on file had not been successful. She said Health Canada had sent a second letter. She said there was a scheduled compliance audit in 17 days. She paused. Then she said, "We need to talk about your license agreement." I let the silence sit for a moment, not to be cruel, just because I needed a second. I said, "I appreciate you calling, Sylvia. I do. But you should know that the 90-day reversion clause becomes effective in 2 days. If the authority wants to discuss a new licensing arrangement, I'm open to that conversation. But it needs to happen before then, and it needs to be the right conversation." Another pause. She said she understood. Here is what I didn't say on that call, but what I had been thinking about for weeks. I didn't want a job back. I didn't want to walk back into that building and sit across from Bryson and pretend the last 5 months hadn't happened. What I wanted, what I'd decided, somewhere on that hike in Banff with Carolyn, was something more structural. If my knowledge and my tools were going to continue powering that infrastructure, I was going to be compensated and credited for that in a way that couldn't be erased the next time someone decided I was inconvenient. The negotiation took 11 days. In the end, the authority entered into a formal licensing agreement with the consulting company I'd incorporated 2 months after my separation. I'd done this quietly, on my lawyer's advice, as a precautionary measure. The agreement included a 5-year term, quarterly licensing fees, and a provision for technical advisory services at my rate, not theirs. Bryson was not in any of those meetings. By that point, I'd heard through Sylvia that his modernization initiative had been placed under review by the board. The compliance audit went ahead on schedule. The plans passed. Sylvia sent me a brief email afterward that said only, "Thank you, Howard. The families in Foothills are lucky, even if they'll never know why." I read it at the kitchen table while Carolyn was making coffee. I didn't forward it to anyone. I didn't post about it. I folded my laptop halfway closed and just sat with it for a minute. My daughter called that evening. She said I still sounded weirdly calm. I told her calm was underrated. There's something I've thought about a lot since then. Not the money, not the outcome, not even Bryson and what happened to his initiative. What I keep coming back to is a conversation I had with Thomas about 2 weeks before Bryson arrived, when there were already rumors about a new director coming in from outside. We were doing a site inspection at the Foothills plant, walking the perimeter fence in the early morning cold, and Thomas asked me if I was worried. I told him I wasn't worried about my job. I was worried about the job, the actual work, the thing that mattered, the infrastructure that people depended on without ever thinking about it. I said the work would outlast both of us. I said that was the point. What I understood by the time that licensing agreement was signed was that protecting the work sometimes meant protecting your ownership of it. Not out of pride, not out of ego, but because there are people on the other side of that work, people filling glasses of water at kitchen sinks in Foothills, in communities across the county, and someone has to be accountable for it being right. I was 57 when they showed me the door. I turned 58 while I was refinishing that deck. The clause wasn't revenge. It was just 31 years of knowing that the work doesn't belong to anyone's modernization strategy. It belongs to the people who understand it. And the people who understand it don't forget a single line of what they built. I think about that morning on the Foothills perimeter fence a lot. The cold, the gravel under our boots, Thomas asking if I was worried. There was frost on the chain link and the mountains were just starting to catch the early light. I told him I wasn't worried about my job. I was worried about the job. There's a difference, and I think that difference is actually what this whole story comes down to. What happened to me, and to Bryson, and to the authority, wasn't complicated. It followed a logic that I've watched play out more times than I can count in 31 years of infrastructure work. When you make decisions based on what looks good in a presentation rather than what's true on the ground, eventually the ground tells you the truth anyway. That's not fate. It's not karma in any mystical sense. It's just cause and effect, running its course at its own pace. Bryson's initiative collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. The system didn't fail because I wanted it to. It failed because the people running it didn't understand what was holding it together. I spent a long time in my career believing that doing good work was its own protection. That if you showed up, maintained your integrity, built things that actually functioned, that would be enough. And for most of my years at the authority, it was. What I didn't account for was the moment when the people evaluating your worth stopped understanding what the work was. When digital native thinking became more legible to the board than 31 years of field knowledge. What I learned. Slowly, sitting at that kitchen table with Carolyn across from me and later walking Johnston Canyon with the snow coming down, is that integrity without preparation is incomplete. The clause in that 2014 agreement wasn't a weapon I'd built. It was a record of a younger version of me insisting that his work had value that deserved to be protected in writing. That took a kind of clear-headedness I almost didn't give myself credit for at the time. You have to know what you've built. You have to be honest about its worth, even when the institution around you is telling you to be quiet about it. And then you have to wait. That part is harder than people think. Those 88 days weren't easy. There were mornings I drove past the Foothills plant on the way to the hardware store and felt something close to grief. But patience isn't passivity. I was thinking, reading, preparing, building the consulting structure on advice I trusted. The waiting was purposeful. The three things I tell anyone in a version of that situation, anyone sitting across from a Bryson who's just handed them a separation package with a warm handshake, are these: know what you built and document it honestly, hold your ground not out of stubbornness but out of clarity, and don't mistake being pushed out for being finished. Those aren't abstract principles. They're what I watched determine the outcome of this specific situation in a boardroom in Calgary. Over 11 days of negotiation. Sylvia's email still sits in my inbox. I haven't deleted it. The families in Foothills are lucky, even if they'll never know why. I read it occasionally, not to feel vindicated, that feeling passed quickly, but to remind myself what the work was actually for. It was never for the authority. It was never for Bryson. It was for the people at the other end of the pipe who just wanted clean water when they turned on the tap. Knowing that made everything else, the separation, the clause, the waiting, straightforward. The work belongs to whoever understands it deeply enough to protect it. That's the only thing I'm certain of.